Paris believed its dead were contained. For centuries, the city buried its bodies inside its own walls. Cemeteries designed for hundreds received thousands. Graves were reopened. Bones were shifted to make space for new arrivals. The system survived wars, winters, and disease, but it was never built for growth. By the late 18th century, the soil beneath central Paris was no longer simply earth. It had become a saturated mass, mud mixed with decaying remains and layers of bone. Then the rains came. In 1780, a cemetery wall collapsed. The ground gave way, and human remains spilled into nearby homes. What had been layered quietly for generations forced itself back into the light. Paris could no longer ignore it. The city had run out of space, and the only direction left was down. The collapse in 1780 was not an accident. It was the visible consequence of a system strained for generations. For centuries, Paris buried its dead within its own walls. Churchyards served as cemeteries, and none was more infamous than Les Innocents, near the crowded markets at the city's center. Used since the Middle Ages, it gradually became less a resting place and more a reservoir of accumulated mortality. Burial space was finite, death was not. Mass graves were reopened repeatedly. When soil reached capacity, older remains were transferred into charnel houses lining the cemetery walls. The ground was disturbed again and again, never allowed to settle. Meanwhile, Paris grew, population increased, buildings pressed closer to cemetery boundaries. Daily life unfolded only meters from decomposing layers separated by little more than stone. Complaints multiplied: foul air, damp foundations, structural weakness. Yet burial practices remained unchanged. Tradition held firm, layer upon layer, year after year. The collapse of 1780 did not create instability. It revealed that the threshold had already been crossed. In the spring of 1780, after weeks of relentless rain, the pressure finally became visible. The cemetery of Les Innocents had endured for centuries. Its walls had been repaired, reinforced, and trusted. But the soil behind them had long since lost its integrity. Saturated by repeated burials and constant disturbance, the ground behaved less like earth and more like a compressed mass under strain, dense, unstable, and unable to absorb more. Water pooled along the perimeter, foundations weakened, mortar softened under persistent humidity. Then, a section of the wall gave way. The collapse was not explosive. It was heavy, gradual, structural. Stone blocks shifted outward under the weight pressing from behind. Mud followed, and with it, the accumulated remains of generations. In nearby homes, particularly those built directly against the cemetery boundary, basements flooded with foul water and displaced bones. Residents awoke to the unmistakable evidence that what had been contained for centuries was no longer stable. The boundary between burial ground and domestic life had physically dissolved. This was not rumor, not superstition, not hysteria. It was material failure. The complaints that had circulated for years about odor, contamination, instability could no longer be dismissed as exaggeration. The crisis was now visible in masonry, mud, and compromised foundations. Paris had not changed its burial practices, and so it had allowed accumulation to replace adaptation. The dead were no longer resting quietly beneath consecrated ground. They were exerting pressure, and they caused panic literal and undeniable. And when a capital city loses control over something as fundamental as burial, the issue ceases to be local. It becomes administrative. What had once been tradition was now infrastructure under collapse. The question was no longer whether something needed to change. It was how and how quickly it could be done. The crisis demanded more than repair. Reinforcing walls would not solve saturation. Reopening graves would not create space. Paris did not need another cemetery. It needed distance. In 1785, the authorities moved decisively. Beyond the southern limits of the city lay abandoned limestone quarries, vast subterranean galleries carved over centuries to supply the stone that built Paris itself. These tunnels extended for miles beneath the outskirts. They were structurally stable, largely unused. They offered what the city above no longer could: depth, separation, containment. The decision was practical rather than ceremonial. Human remains would be removed from inner-city cemeteries and transferred underground, beyond dense neighborhoods and fragile foundations. Night after night, covered carts moved through narrow streets, carrying the accumulated dead toward the former quarries. What had once rested beneath markets and homes would now be relocated into engineered space. Paris would not expand outward. It would reorganize beneath its own foundations. The transfer did not happen in haste. It was organized. Beginning in 1785, the cemetery of Les Innocents was emptied in stages. Work took place primarily at night, when the city was quieter, and disruption could be minimized. Covered wagons moved slowly through narrow streets. Clergy accompanied them, reciting brief rites as the remains were transported beyond the crowded center of Paris. There was no spectacle, no public ceremony marking the end of centuries. What had accumulated over generations was handled methodically. Soil was cleared. Bones were separated, collected, loaded in measured quantities. Records were kept. Routes were established. The objective was not traditional reverence. It was structural correction. South of the city, abandoned limestone quarries were prepared. Tunnels were inspected, ceilings reinforced, stone pillars added where necessary, access shafts secured. The underground network, once a source of building material, was repurposed into infrastructure. Inside the galleries, remains were arranged with deliberate order. Long bones formed retaining walls. Skulls were placed outward in uniform rows, concealing deeper deposits behind them. Weight was redistributed along corridors carved from solid limestone. This was not improvisation. It was systematization. Where mass graves had compressed bodies into unstable ground, the subterranean galleries provided engineered containment. The dead were no longer beneath markets, wells, and foundations. They were relocated into space designed to bear pressure. Mortality had been removed from daily life, not erased, but reorganized. Paris imposed order on accumulation, not through denial, but through design. The transfers continued for years. Cemetery after cemetery was emptied. Saint-Étienne, aka Saint-Nicolas-des-Champs, smaller parish grounds followed. What had once been scattered beneath churches and markets was consolidated beneath stone. Below the city, the tunnels changed. What began as logistical necessity gradually acquired form. Corridors were organized, walls reinforced, arrangements made deliberate. Rows of bones were stacked with precision, transforming loose accumulation into structured containment. Above ground, Paris stabilized. Odors diminished. Foundations dried. Streets reclaimed their ordinary rhythm. The crisis receded from sight, yet nothing had been erased. Beneath the southern edge of the city, miles of galleries now held the material memory of generations, not as graves in soil, but as architecture, not as decay pressing upward, but as weight redistributed into stone. The solution had not denied mortality. It had relocated it. Paris had moved its dead out of daily life, but not out of existence. They remained, ordered, silent, below. The collapse of 1780 did not introduce a new problem. It made an old one impossible to ignore. For generations, Paris buried its dead within its own walls. The arrangement reflected proximity between parish and grave, ritual and routine, life and memory. It endured because the city was smaller, its density manageable, and its limits less visible. Growth altered that balance. Population increased. Construction tightened. Foundations pressed against ground that had been disturbed for centuries. What had once been sufficient gradually became unstable. The crisis was not sudden. It accumulated quietly, layered into soil, mortar, and routine. When the wall failed, the illusion of containment failed with it. The boundary separating daily life from what lay beneath it proved thinner than anyone had assumed. The decision that followed was administrative, rather than symbolic. The city recognized the constraint and adjusted accordingly. Burial practices were relocated into space capable of bearing weight. The solution did not erase the dead. It redistributed them into an environment designed for permanence rather than compression. Above ground, Paris continued its transformation into a modern capital. Streets widened, neighborhoods reorganized, expansion resumed under new assumptions about space and stability. Below ground, order replaced compression. The catacombs remain as evidence of that shift, not as legend, but as infrastructure. They mark the moment a city acknowledged that tradition alone could not support growth at scale. Paris did not conquer mortality, it recalibrated around it. In doing so, it revealed something fundamental about urban life. Cities endure not by preserving every habit, but by confronting their limits and restructuring when those limits become visible. Adaptation is rarely dramatic. It is structural, quiet, deliberate, and lasting.